because North Korea has already been discussed and is going to be discussed in greater detail, and West Asia is outside our territorial ambit. And in any case, even though West Asia has a nuclear armed state, Israel, not declared, but there, and you have a nuclear capable state in Iran, but Iran is under constraints. So it's unlikely that a nuclear conflict will take place in West Asia. So let's focus on South Asia and see what the situation is like. Well, as I mentioned, the major nuclear powers there, India, China, Pakistan, have serious bilateral disputes among themselves. Now, Pakistan, for instance, is facing charges of terrorism, cross-border terrorism from all three neighbors, from Iran, from Afghanistan, and from India. The line of control is currently flaring up with firing going on almost continuously. I think India-Pakistan relations are at the lowest ebb since 2003. Tensions are also high between India and China. There is China's claims over Indian territory, disagreements over India's application for the nuclear suppliers group, and many other issues. So if I focus on South Asia, it'd be clear that we have to watch this unstable triangle between India, China, and Pakistan. Now, in my discussion paper, I have given details of the nuclear assets of the three states. I will not go into the details here because of shorter time. But overall, three countries together have between them more than 500 nuclear weapons with a similar number of delivery platforms. In the case of China, it has the longest range of its delivery platforms. India is not very far behind. And Pakistan, in any case, has the capability to cover the entire territory of India. Now, China and India, interestingly, as was brought out in the last panel, have many similarities in their nuclear doctrine, especially no first use. Pakistan does not subscribe to a no first use, and further, that Pakistan's entire nuclear program is aimed at India. It is India-specific, and unlike India and China, Pakistan regards nuclear weapons as usable weapons in war, and they intend to use it against India when certain very vague red lines are breached. Now, a new element has contributed to the nuclear instability in South Asian region by Pakistan introducing the tactical nuclear weapons with a short range of about 60 kilometers, which the Pakistanis say they will use against Indian forces coming towards Pakistan. And I just learned at a recent Track 2 meeting in Bangkok that the Pakistani thinking is they will extend the TNW to maritime warfare, namely use it against ships on the ocean, which is another dreadful thought that is going to create further instability. So there is the additional global anxiety about the terrorist groups that are based in Pakistan. Groups like the Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, the Lashkar-e-Toiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen, Haqqani Network, a whole coalition of international terrorist groups which have had deadly attacks on Afghanistan and India and against the foreign troops in Afghanistan. Pakistani terrorist groups have tried to attack Pakistani nuclear installations, and the fear is that if fissile material or a bomb falls into the hands of the terrorist groups, then you can imagine what the consequences will be. So what then should the non-nuclear armed states do in this situation? First of all, we must understand in the South Asia context that you are talking about three very densely populated states, China, India, and Pakistan. Between them, about 2.5 billion people. And any nuclear conflict between these two states is going to have a fallout on the neighboring states, is inevitable. So the non-nuclear armed states are collateral victims of nuclear conflict between the major powers. Now, unfortunately, there is no role for the non-nuclear armed states which has been assigned to them. The NPT created a power structure which is very similar to the UN. Like the UN Security Council, the power is vested in the P5. And in the case of the NPT, the power is vested in the N5. And non-nuclear weapon states have virtually no role except to be passive victims of the policies of the nuclear weapon powers. Now, in this situation, I think we are starting virtually from ground zero. The main thing is that the non-nuclear weapon states must get together, must mobilize the resources, show solidarity in pursuing the interests and in giving notice to the handful of nuclear powers that their interests must also be taken into account. So what would I suggest in terms of the role of the non-nuclear weapon states? Number one, strengthening civil society action. This is not a new proposal. It was passed by the UN General Assembly in December 2002, which recognized the role of civil society organizations in promoting disarmament and non-proliferation education. A number of civil society organizations have been working tirelessly. The International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear Wars and the Pugwash Conference have got recognition through the Nobel Peace Prize. You have Global Zero, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the NTI, and our own network of the APLN, the European Leadership Network, and the Latin American networks. But the disappointing fact is, as the CNND report of 2015 pointed out, there has been little impact outside the specialist disarmament and non-proliferation circles.
Lalit, could I suggest you just mention the others and come back to elaboration later?
Okay. So we have to be conscious that we have done work, but it hasn't reached out to the people who matter. Number two, the regional organizations should act as platforms for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Here we have a number of regional organizations. You have got the European Union, the African Union, ASEAN, SCO, BRICS, SAARC, and so on. But most of these organizations do not recognize the need to discuss nuclear issues. SAARC, for instance, which is in South Asia, is prohibited by its charter from taking up security issues of a regional nature. So I'm suggesting here that the NNAS, non-nuclear armed states, may consider urging the regional organizations to initiate exchanges on the potential threats to member states from nuclear conflict in the region. The East Asia Summit, I think, would be an ideal platform because it brings together the 10 ASEAN states on the same platform with the major nuclear armed states of the world. Okay, number three is an expansion of the nuclear weapons free zones. Now, here again, it's not a new idea, but the fact is there was a movement which has been stalled. We have two nuclear weapons free zones in Asia, the Southeast Asia NWFZ and the Central Asia nuclear free zone. Two more are under discussion, the Northeast Asia and the Middle East nuclear weapons free zones. It's unlikely, looking at the current political situation, that these two new concepts will make any progress. Now, I want to cite the case of Mongolia, which has taken the lead in declaring itself as a nuclear weapon-free state.
Sorry, Lalit, I will ask you to just...
Okay.
Sorry.
Fourth is changes in nuclear doctrine. We spoke a lot about the NFU. I think the non-nuclear weapon states must vigorously lobby for persuading the nuclear weapon states to change their doctrine of first use and join China and India in declaring NFU. And finally, I'm asking for a nuclear dialogue amongst the nuclear armed states. 3 countries in Asia which are approximate to each other and have problems with each other, do not have vehicles for cooperation and consultations on nuclear issues. India and Pakistan have a platform, but it's at a low level, at a middle level. A joint working group on nuclear CBMs has not met for the last 3 years and is not likely to meet. I'm suggesting that China and India, India and Pakistan, and maybe Pakistan and China should establish channels of communication specifically on nuclear issues. I have urged my Chinese colleagues here to at least start a track 2, which will be on a trilateral basis between our 3 countries. So my conclusion is that while we are a bit dispirited that the global anti-nuclear warrior community is showing a sense of fatigue, I think there is hope in what we have seen, a fresh impulse towards a nuclear weapon ban treaty that is injecting a sense of enthusiasm, but there are huge problems still ahead. I think it is the responsibility of organizations like ours to sustain the momentum, keep the torch aloft, and hand it over to a new and younger generation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lalit, for those very concrete 5 suggestions, which are interesting and I'm sure will stimulate a lot of interest. Let's move right along. Marianne.
Thank you. The first thing I'd like to note is that I don't think there's much that we can say which is actually new here, but I think there are things, as Lalit mentioned, that we need to re-emphasize and re-energize, and I think this is absolutely important. In the paper I've distributed, I talk first of all about the problems that the region is facing, right? Modernization problems, the costs, the opportunity costs, and then, of course, the dangers. And I think that we have all become far too complacent about the risks of accidental or even deliberate launch of nuclear weapons. And this is something that needs urgent attention. So what can nuclear weapons, what can the non-nuclear weapon states do? I have just talked about devaluing, reducing the salience of nuclear weapons in the doctrines of the nuclear weapon states, adopting clear and unambiguous no first use policies is clearly part of that, de-alerting where there are forces which are on high alert, delegitimizing, which is encouraging the nuclear weapon states to adhere to the humanitarian arguments which have been raised and explored in depth quite recently, and which are in line with the tenets of international humanitarian law. And then, of course, ultimately denuclearizing, recommitting to a goal of a nuclear weapons-free world. But I think all of us who argue for this understand that this is a long-term process. We're not asking for results overnight. But what is alarming and very, very troubling is that none of the even relatively minor and relatively cost-free steps, such as no first use, security assurances, lowering the currency of nuclear weapons, these are not being done, and they need to be done. These are steps. And earlier, Rajma, you were asking about no first use in the previous session. It's absolutely essential as one step that can be taken to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons, and then we move on to problems with deterrence and sort of building down. Very quickly, I'll just talk about 2 other things that I believe are important, which I can flesh out in conversation. First of all, I think we need to re-examine the problems inherent in nuclear deterrence. There are. I think we assume far too readily that nuclear deterrence has always worked in the past and it's always going to work in the future. And that is a huge assumption on a number of levels. The other thing I want to say is that we need to encourage a delinking of alliance status from overt extended nuclear deterrence. To me, one of the glaring omissions in this entire debate is there's no discussion about conventional nuclear capabilities. And we've fallen into the trap over the years, and it's never been as pronounced as it is now, of automatically thinking that deterrence has to involve nuclear weapons. And this is absurd, especially when we think about the build-up of conventional weaponry in the region. There is no good reason why we cannot focus more on the conventional weapons capabilities and the whole of state capabilities as a deterrent actor against nuclear weapons, against nuclear weapon states. So I think there really has to be some examination of this linking, this automatic linking, which has become a habit of deterrence as being nuclear deterrence, and this ignoring conventional weapons. I think that with regard to extended nuclear deterrence, there are quite a few things that the nuclear umbrella states can do, right? So they're non-nuclear states. They've got an important role to play. And I think accepting no first use doctrines is very important. We know that in this region it was caution on the part of regional states which prevented Obama from moving towards a more explicit no first use position. So we need to look at that. And we need to look also at the where are we? Sorry. Right, we need to consider what are credible deterrent options. And this is another argument, I would say, for moving towards emphasizing conventional weapons deterrence, because the credibility problem of extended nuclear deterrence is very, very strong, and I think it's something that we have to examine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Millie.
Thank you. I'd like to take off from what Ambassador Lalita said earlier on, when you talk about what roles for non-nuclear weapon states to actually reduce existing tensions. And basically, Ambassador said there's really not much you can do. I'm coming from a region which has, for the longest time, treasured the peace and security that it has built over the last 40, 50 years. It was a region, Southeast Asia, at one time known to be the Balkans of the East, but through some restraint, accommodation and all that, was able to now maintain this peace and was able to engage with a wider community outside the region to come up with different multilateral forums. And with that, I guess, instead of then saying that there's really not much we can do, because realistically, when you look at the power equation, Southeast Asia is a region that's really located, it's situated in a region where you have South Asia, you have Northeast Asia, which have its own security dynamics. And as the ambassadors have said, also have nuclear weapons. But one of the key feature, I think, of the region is that as early as 1971, it declared that it should be a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. And part of that declaration in 1971 was the statement of a goal towards a nuclear weapons-free zone. And in 1995, the Southeast Asian countries came up with a treaty on Southeast Asian nuclear weapons-free zone, which is called the Sianfes Treaty, which basically stated its position that it wants to be free from any domination of any great power in Southeast Asia, and expressing its anxiety over the risk posed by nuclear weapons, and that it will be a region free of nuclear weapons for as long as it can. And in the most recent declarations of the ASEAN political community, starting from 2003 and again iterated most recently, the whole goal of a Southeast Asian nuclear weapons-free zone has been iterated. And there have been attempts to get the nuclear weapon states to sign on to this treaty. Attempts have been made ever so often. They have not been successful for various reasons. One, of course, is the reservation by nuclear weapon states over rights of sovereignty over territory, questions of exclusive economic zone and continental shelves, and, of course, the provision for negative security assurances. But nonetheless, given this kind of a situation, do you then give up and say we don't have a role? And I think if you look at the experience of ASEAN and its turn towards multilateralism in the 1990s, one could then say, well, you can do what you do best, essentially, and that is becoming and continuing to become a facilitator or convener of various types of dialogue. So in other words, if you talk about three things that you can do in the region, given all the nuclear dynamics that's taking place, all the concerns, not to mention the fact there are other security threats that are pressing on the region. Aside from nuclear weapons, we have territorial disputes, we have the threat of radical extremism, violent extremism, we have the threat of climate change and its attendant threats of food security, water security, health security, whatever you may call it. ASEAN could capitalize on this peace dividend and expand its political capital to promote and further advance efforts in actually enhancing and promoting confidence-building measures, preventive diplomacy, and conflict resolution in the region, which brings into its ambit all the major powers in the region. If you look at the geographical footprint of the kind of ASEAN-led institutions, and I think one of the questions in this panel, which I'll come back later on, is that you actually, through this ASEAN-led institutions, you bring in all the major powers in the region and those countries that are themselves nuclear weapon states. And it is through this dialogue where, I guess, issues about threat perceptions, issues about security concerns can at least be articulated, and to an extent possible, some kind of understanding can be established. Second is, I guess, on its own right, ASEAN can collectively support many of the international initiatives, most recently the initiative on the ban treaty and efforts to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons and leading towards its total elimination. And at the regional level, on its own, look at what it can do to help promote nuclear governance through implementation of things like strategic trade control programs and support for multilateral treaties such as Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. Third is actually, as mentioned earlier also by Ambassador Lalet, empower and engage with a number of civil society groups to push for the agenda of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. We have in this body among us the APLN, but aside from APLN, you do have Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific and all the other civil society groups. There's a vibrant civil society groups in the region. Encourage and engage with them and to work towards a nuclear-free region. And finally, support the idea of no longer being a bystander in this world of nuclear competition. ASEAN must have a voice. Southeast Asian countries must have a voice aside from pushing towards, promoting the Southeast Asian nuclear weapons free zone, engaging and must having voice in the international fora of what it thinks nuclear weapon states should actually be doing and expressing its concerns and no longer saying that nuclear weapons threats is irrelevant to the region. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Young-soo.
Hi, my name is Yong-soo Hwang from South Korea. Actually, I'm not expert for the foreign policy, but I'm working for the technical development and of the spent nuclear fuel and all kind of the back and fuel cycle business for my entire lifetime. Actually, I have studied this one for more than 35 years, and I'm about to be retired within 5 years. It's frustrating whenever you are talking about what would be the role of the non-nuclear weapon state. But I firmly believe that there is a strong role for any non-nuclear weapon state in the world. Especially now we are in the session of the Jeju Forum, which is not the governmental seminar or conference, but it's kind of the civilian and NGO activities. And I'd like to emphasize all the active participants of all the civilians, including social, political scientists and the natural scientists, how to actually increase the 국가의 to further disseminate the global nuclear security. We learned a lot of the convention and the international framework, so on. But to really implement that one, we need a team effort among political leaders, civil societies, and the scientific leaders. And I'd like to emphasize some 5 or 4 things. First of all, we have to encourage how to share the lessons from the leaders of the non-nuclear weapon state. For example, South Korea has enjoyed the benefit of a nuclear power plant since 1974. Nowadays, we are in the middle of a transition. Probably the new government would like to encourage the renewable energy more. But still, South Korea enjoyed a lot from the power generation of the nuclear energy. And we learned a lot of lessons, some good ones and some bad ones. And we made a mistake. Honestly, we should say we made a mistake. But we don't want to make those kind of mistakes happen in other countries. Nowadays, we have a lot of newcomers, especially from the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And how to share our own experience with the newcomers will be very important. For that one, we need a teamwork, like a multilateral approach or international consortium to encourage all the stakeholders to abide by the spirit of the global nuclear security. I just returned from Tokyo. I was in Tokyo until this morning. And we'd like to have a creation of the small consortium, technical consortium, to manage the spent nuclear fuel disposal. And we had a good participation from Japan, South Korea, United States, Taiwan, and China, and so on. And there, even though we are not so familiar with each other from the beginning, we can get one conclusion. Multilateral approach is very important because it can create an openness to everybody. So to have an openness for the technology development and the policy development is very important. Without any openness, you may end up with some kind of latent activities. So in order to avoid any kind of mistake in the future, it's very important to once again think about openness among our neighborhood countries. And we should actually disseminate this kind of lesson to the newcomers, actually. And also, we should cultivate and disseminate so-called 3S culture. We are not just talking about safety. We should combine the safety, security, and the safeguardability together and try to set up the new norm to assure the transparent global cooperation to ensure the nuclear non-proliferation. And we have a lot of experience to create that kind of things. But many times we failed. And we might fail in the future also. But still we need a consistent effort. I'd like to borrow one statement made by Nelson Mandela. He states that it always seems impossible until it is done. That's most important. All our effort for the global security and the nuclear non-proliferation might be useless until we have a final success. But we should learn lesson from his statement. We should have a team effort to support the global nuclear society. And for that one specifically, I'd like to emphasize the importance of the international mechanism for the fresh fuel supply and the spent fuel management together. Throughout that kind of international mechanism, we can discourage some bad guys who would like to develop so-called ENN technology, enrichment and reprocessing technology, which are the biggest danger from the newcomer in the future. And we have a lot of lessons throughout IAEA activities and all UN security actions. We spend a lot of time after the Indian experiment in the middle of the 70s. And we sometimes could make some progress, but we should learn what would be the lessons that we can use to create a better collaboration among international society. And also, we can help with each other to introduce very rigorous quality assurance system. Quality assurance system is very important to discourage any kind of latent activities. And we can discuss those things throughout later discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm going to come back to you very soon. What I'm going to do is ask questions, direct them to one person on the panel, but then ask if any of the other panelists would like to respond as well. So they don't have to, but if they want to, they can come in on that. The first question is, what's the risk of further nuclear proliferation in the Asia-Pacific? But there's two components to that. And the first part of that I'd like to direct to Lalit, if I may, and that is, what are the political and strategic dimensions of the proliferation drivers, and where might we expect further proliferation in Asia-Pacific on these, based on political and strategic factors? Lalit.
Well, I don't think there is any likelihood of new players coming in the field, of new nuclear armed states coming up. The international climate is certainly hostile to it, and even the kind of opportunities that were available to Pakistan and India in 1998 are not there. But if you look further west, West Asia, certainly, with the kind of rivalry we see between Israel and Iran, and if the Iran agreement does not hold, you can be sure that Iran will go for nuclear weapons, and then there'll be a cascading effect. You'll have Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, other countries following. So the situation is towards the west of Asia, where there will be the likely nuclear powers coming from in the future.
So you would completely discount the possibility of nuclear weapons proliferation in Japan and South Korea, despite the speculation in the press we've had about these two?
Well, from what we have heard from our colleagues here, who I presume represent Japanese public opinion as well, there are strong non-proliferation sentiments in both South Korea and Japan, and I think they will be sensible enough not to go in for nuclear weapons.
Okay, Yong-Soo, what about if you could elaborate at this stage now, continuing where you were, on the technical risks of proliferation and the barriers and controls that can be put in place. And if you want to link it to the political, you can as well, and then I'll open it to the other panelists on either part of that question.
Yeah. As you already well know, if you'd like to do something for the ENR research, then it might be a kind of loopholes in the future. But there are a lot of practical ways to discourage any kind of bad attempt. As you already know, we have a very strict regulation about the additional protocol. So as long as a certain state abides by the additional protocol, the chance for the bad guys' activity will be diminishing very rapidly. So how to properly apply the additional protocol with the full implementation of the quality assurance might be the key factors to discourage that kind of activities. The concept of the quality assurance is very important technologically. If you are talking about serious quality assurance, you should abide by 5 principles: traceability, transparency, review, retrievability, and reproducibility. So as long as you follow those kind of things at the real field site, then it will diminish any kind of risk eventually.
Thank you very much. Do either of Melly or Marianne wish to come in? No? Okay. Melly, can I come back to you? And now is the time, as you anticipated, to elaborate on the role of regional structures. And as you were indicating, across Asia and the Pacific, Southeast Asia and ASEAN, and I note while we were speaking, another APLN member walked in, Dr. Marty Natlegawa, the former Foreign Minister of Indonesia. So welcome, Marty. But, how much can ASEAN fill in the existing institutional gaps, both in Northeast Asia and South Asia? Can it do so? Can it provide examples only? What about the existing structures? And of course, we do have some Pan-Asia Pacific structures as well. Just spend some time on that.
I would rather Ambassador or ex-Minister Marty speak on my behalf because he's here.
I'm sure you would, but he's not going to until later.
And
you do it now.
he's done such a great job in trying to promote, the Southeast Asian Weapons Free ASEAN Fest. And I think during the, if I recall very clearly, in 2011, we all there was a lot of optimism that we could finally get at least some nuclear weapon states to actually sign on. But what can Southeast Asian really do? What is I raised the thing about it can do what it does best. And that is that it's very realistic about how much it can do. It doesn't have, obviously, it cannot match the material power that all the other, like its big neighbor China or India, the United States and Japan. But it can capitalize on its credibility as an institution that has been successful through its promotion of regional norms, habits of cooperation, capitalize on that to actually engage with the major powers and bring them together and lock them in. And that was, into this web of interlocking linkages and cooperative kind of endeavors. And in all areas, whether it's security, political, and economic. And by capitalizing on the peace dividend, and you are then able to perhaps, if not address it, highlight the importance of peace and prosperity in the region. If you look at what it has done over the last 50 years, ASEAN is now 50. There were those, I recall in 1997 when there was the crisis in the region, and people were saying, ASEAN basically is a sunset organization, and it cannot do anything to help itself. But it was able to get back on its feet and retool itself by putting in place certain mechanisms to address many of what you call transnational problems, whether it is in maritime security, cooperation, and piracy, etc., by stressing habits of cooperation and stressing norms of peaceful, non-use of force. You have that, if you like, positive influence that could then, have a persuasive influence on behavior of states. Now, what it has is the normative power, and sometimes we take for granted what it can do. But the fact that it has been able to continually engage with all these major powers, even the new president-elect of the United States, who at one point during his campaign never mentioned at all the importance of ASEAN, I think has found it to his advantage to actually be present in the East Asia Summit, if only to help to enhance its status and allow it to interact with its counterpart in the region. So I guess that is what it can do: stress and have and, as I said, bring together all these countries. Dr. Natalegawa has talked even about enhancing the ASEAN Treaty of Amity cooperation and making it bigger, make it an Indo-Pacific treaty, because it feels that it needs to be revisited, and there has to be a rethinking and a recommitment, not just among Southeast Asian states, but the wider region, about the importance of non-use of force and the importance of the respect for, for certain norms and the promotion of certain norms in order to, if you like, to bring back the confidence that, as always, that seems to be compromised in light of the kind of major serious challenges to the region's security. Thank you.
Thanks, Melly. Marianne, the other regional nuclear weapon-free zone, of course, that we have in the Asia-Pacific is SPINFIZ, the South Pacific nuclear-free zone. A two-part question to you. Do you think in today's global environment, with its implications for the region, we would be able to negotiate that in the South Pacific? And the second part is, again, are there examples to be learned from within Asia-Pacific by the other two sub-regions for stabilizing and institutionalizing nuclear peace arrangements?
Yes, thank you, Ramesh. I'd have to answer your first question. I think that Australia would probably resist belonging to a SPINFIZ if that was being proposed now. I think that the Australian government has moved so far towards identification with the United States and supporting the United States unquestioningly that I suspect it would be very hard to establish that with Australia as a partner. The other states, yes, I think that would be relatively easy to negotiate, but it wouldn't take the same kind of form that it does today. Your second question was about the lessons we might learn from from the nuclear weapon-free zones that we have in the region. Well, I mean, there has been a lot of study done on the possibility of establishing a Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. But again, these haven't really gone anywhere. Now, having said that, I still think that there is a lot of potential for increasing confidence-building mechanisms, establishing procedures of dialogue at a high level, but also at the Track 2 level and civil society level. And if I may just say, the proposal for the Middle East Conference on a zone free of WMD, which of course has never come to pass. That was part of the NPT agreement. In 2012, when that conference was due to be held and it wasn't held, a group of scholars and we put together a civil society grouping. And we had a conference, which was supposed to be sort of the parallel conference. We actually had representation from almost all of the states, including from Israel and Iran, the two states that, whose policy makers would not have attended such a conference. So I think that there's plenty of, I don't see any likelihood of establishing a Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone in the short to medium term at least, but I do think that there is still a lot of room for exploring and implementing strategies of dialogue and confidence and security building measures.
Thanks, Marianne. Lalit, can I return to you? Again, two parts. First, if you'd like now to elaborate on one of your 5 strands that you mentioned, and that is the importance of nuclear policy dialogues among the nuclear weapon possessing countries of Asia and the Pacific. And second, to link it to the present question, whether in fact it would not be more productive to nest such a dialogue in a broader overarching security arrangement that we seem to lack. In other words, as we have heard repeatedly, and as indeed you were emphasizing yourself, the collateral damage from any nuclear war would be considerably broader in its geographic footprint than just the countries fighting with nuclear weapons. And that being the case, should we not look with some urgency to broader regional security architectures in which to explore these dilemmas and to look for solutions?
Well, thank you. I think the dialogue, the nuclear dialogue amongst the Asian countries, particularly India, Pakistan and China, is important because unlike in the case of the Cold War when there was geographical separation between the two nuclear powers, between the Americans and the Soviets, we do not have that luxury. And therefore, we have no protection time in South Asia. Secondly, it will definitely have collateral damage on the neighboring countries. This much is guaranteed. And most of the countries are smaller countries which do not have the capability to protect themselves. So I think we need to emphasize the need for the dialogue. And there are no platforms there. At the government level, we are bravely trying to have track 2 dialogues in order to keep the conversation going. As for your second point, should this not be part of a broader security architecture? Well, ideally so. But there is no such broad security architecture visible in our region. Now, I know that all of us like to say that we have full faith in ASEAN and, ASEAN will be the guarantor of security and so on. But the fact is ASEAN doesn't have a security structure. And when it comes to a crisis situation, there are divisions within ASEAN. ASEAN doesn't have the capability to protect its own interests. I think I probably overstated, but ASEAN has protected itself on the basis of goodwill. And it has plenty of goodwill from everybody. But that itself does not prevent any kind of flare-up taking place. So in the case of India, what we are doing is we face a threat in the Indian Ocean area. So we are working with like-minded countries which are promoting the idea of freedom of the sea lanes of commerce. And we are doing it multilaterally, but more importantly, we're doing it bilaterally with the maritime countries of Southeast Asia, with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with Singapore, with all our neighboring countries. We have bilateral consultations on mutual security and defense cooperation. But I wish that ASEAN would come up with a security structure that all of us could join and therefore keep the entire area safe, particularly the what we call the Indo-Pacific area.
Thanks, Lalit. I think we tend to forget just how serious and substantial were some of the disputes in the region now covered by ASEAN 50 years ago, and the potential for serious major interstate disputes and internal conflicts going out of hand, and the extent to which the habits of dialogue, the personal relationships, and the conversion of these into institutionalized arrangements have contributed to the point where that fear is now no longer a relevant consideration. So I don't think we should ignore the contribution that deliberate policies have made to this happy result today. But that is a comment from the moderator for the moment. However, it does lead into the next question which I wanted to raise, and that is, where exactly should we look for the leadership needed to curb tensions, the geopolitical tensions that are drivers of nuclear policies, and of course to reduce nuclear threats? And again, if I could come back to Marianne for this, and perhaps you'd like to elaborate on some of the issues that you had in your paper.
Where to look for leadership? I think that's really difficult. I mean, within the region, Clearly, we can look at individuals, we could look at organizations, and I do think the APLN has some role to play here. But ultimately, we need, I think, leadership from the states themselves. The nuclear weapon states, the nuclear umbrella states, and a much more sort of decisive commitment to easing the current tensions. This is absolutely fundamental. Even if we're not going to get to zero nuclear weapons quickly, there is a lot that can be done with good leadership to provide an element of safety and security, which we really seem to be lacking at the moment. So I don't really think that's answering your question particularly well, and others may have better suggestions. But one of the things that I did mention in my sort of introduction was this need to de-link alliance status with an overt extended nuclear deterrence policy. And this is something that I think we can challenge, we can study it, we can examine ways in which a greater focus on conventional weapons deterrence could be more applicable and, in fact, more credible as a deterrent measure in a region of uncertainty and instability.
Anyone else from the panel want to respond to that question on leadership? Yes, please.
Well, from India's point of view, I'll tell you where we are looking for leadership. Number one, from ASEAN collectively. I think ASEAN can do a lot more and use its existing structures, and particularly the East Asia Summit, I think should be used more effectively. From individual states, yes, we're looking for leadership from strong countries in the region like Japan, from South Korea, from Australia. These are countries that can play really a role in the collective security of the region. Thank you.
Melly, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to, without having to rub it in. I mean, initially you said ASEAN is really useless. Well, if you really talk about...
No.
It doesn't have a security arrangement, particularly...
I wish to withdraw that misunderstanding.
I was going to say, you can never expect ASEAN to transform itself into a security arrangement. In fact, when in 2003, when Indonesia raised the idea of an ASEAN security community, there was a lot of interest from the Europeans to say, is this going to be an alliance arrangement? And I think from the very beginning, when it started, it was established in 1967 and hands on, it was very careful that it should not be seen as a military alliance arrangement because it believes that the focus should be on cooperative security, rather than collective security. The approach has been very careful. What they have done since 2005 is to augment the current dialogue process from just confining it to foreign ministers, but now to include the defense ministers. So you now have within the East Asia, within the ASEAN and the wider East Asia framework, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, which brings together all the countries in the East Asia Summit. And I think just to underscore a point that you had also mentioned, Ramesh, is that it's not just an all JoJo exercise. I mean, as you yourself mentioned, Ambassador, there's a lot of cooperation that's taking place that really address serious security issues, not just, and we talk about cooperation in maritime security, looking at piracy, cooperation in terrorism. There's been a lot of cooperation out there. Cooperation which brings together the military at the same time addresses the human security concerns is the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, which has really, if you talk about connecting with people and their security issues, this makes it goes a long way. So it is through this different kind of cooperative exercises where you enhance, truly enhance confidence building exercises just beyond dialoguing. So I think that is one thing that should be stressed. But I go back to my point that I made earlier, that it's about time, given the seriousness of the issue of nuclear threat in the region, that ASEAN, through the fact the East Asia Summit, should actually talk about this more openly, and they should have a voice and must seem to be actually participating in the regional and global discourse on what needs to be done. Yeah.
I'm going to do something on the spur of the moment and without warning to those on whom I'm going to call. And that is, I'm going to ask 4 people from the audience specific questions related to the last one before opening it up in general for Q&A, because I'd like to have a discussion on this. It's a very critical issue for all of us, precisely because of what Ambassador Man Singh said, which is that if there was to be a nuclear war, none of us would be unaffected. This is not something where only those countries using nuclear weapons would suffer from. Firstly, Gareth, I'm going to come to you. And I'll explain why. I think everyone in the region recognizes what a key architect you were of some of the major institutional innovations which attempted to consolidate good relationships across Asia Pacific. If you were foreign minister today, and assuming that you had a congenial government backing you rather than the government we actually have in Canberra, what is it that you'd like to be able to do today in order to advance the peace and stability, and particularly the nuclear stability?
That's a hell of a big question, but sorry, do we need a mic? Or?
You've never shied away from big questions.
Well, I continue to be very much in favour of dialogue mechanisms, confidence building, human relationships, all that stuff, getting people better understanding where each other are coming from, and the institutional arrangements that facilitate that. I have to say I've been pretty disappointed with the evolution of some of the things that I've been personally largely responsible for. APEC has got a massive infrastructure and has done some useful things in terms of trade facilitation and liberalisation. But in terms of any larger cooperative momentum, and there's the silly shirt photo opportunities, what people remember most about APEC, and that's not enough to make a real contribution to present dynamics. EAS, the new East Asian Summit, is the hope of the side, I think, because it gathers together all the major players in the region, from India across to the United States, and at head of government level, and with the brief that's open to discuss both economic and security issues. And I agree absolutely with what's been said about the necessity for that particular agenda to get a leg up, to get a move on, and for some serious discussion to take place within that, some serious confidence building measures. The other mechanism we do have, the ASEAN Regional Forum, which I was largely responsible for initiating, I guess, to kick you guys along, help from the Canadians, has been a complete disappointment. We've got 27 members. It was established at the beginning in anticipation that it would evolve over time from a confidence-building discussion body to a conflict prevention mechanism to a conflict resolution mechanism. And frankly, it's been profoundly disappointing on all those fronts. We've seen some recent progress, I guess, on the South China Sea again at last, with a little bit of cooperative engagement between China and ASEAN and the 4 members, but really there's a long way to go. But look, I don't think these institutional mechanisms are ultimately going to get us there in terms of fending off the most serious dangers of nuclear confrontation. The renewed focus on increasing armories, the renewed talk about the usability of nuclear weapons, the unwillingness to come to grips with doctrinal changes of the kind we discussed earlier today are all pretty serious developments, and an awful lot is going to depend, I think, not so much on the larger institutional frameworks, but the US allies in particular rethinking fundamentally where they're at. I mean, the most crucial players in this respect, the East Asian region, the European ones are relevant too, of course, but Japan, South Korea and Australia really have to fundamentally rethink their position on nuclear issues and really fundamentally put some pressure on the United States rather than being a source of consolation and solace for the United States when it starts careering off the rails, as it is now again. It just was not the support. There was a magic moment with Obama, 2009 onwards, when he was both intellectually and emotionally committed to serious movement towards a nuclear weapon-free world. Had he had support from the Allies, serious support from Korea, Korea toyed with the idea, and Chung Yong-woo was a very important person in that respect, and he would personally, I know, have liked to move in that direction. Japan ducked the cover, ran away completely, hates nuclear weapons, but loves nuclear weapons for all sorts of misconceived security reasons. Australia behaved abominably throughout that period under its current leadership. No interest whatsoever in putting any pressure on the state. Whether it would have made any real difference given the equal pressures of that kind, certainly pressures from the Eastern and Central European allies in the context of renewed Russian assertiveness, is another question. But it sure as hell would have made a difference, I think, in terms of this region. And I think, frankly, the role of those particular countries in the nuclear agenda is going to be more significant in the future than the role of the collective institutions. But the point Ramesh made is a perfectly valid and apt and very sensible one about the huge conflict prevention significance of ASEAN. However disappointing ASEAN is to so many of us so often for not doing more assertive things, its mere existence and the habits of mind it's created and the impossibility of contemplating conflict between its members has been a huge step forward given the history of that region. So I don't want to downplay it, but in the nuclear context, I think we've got to look for other mechanisms, other players to be influential.
Thanks, Gareth. If I can move from the Chancellor of the Australian National University to an alumnus of the ANU, Marty, you're the only ex-foreign minister of an ASEAN state that I can see in the room, and not just any ASEAN member state, but a substantial one. You've heard what the panelists have had to say. Please respond.
I'm not sure whether I'm in a position to respond to all the important points raised, but let me, Ramesh, share this couple of points, thoughts on a couple of points. One is on Shonfish, on the Southeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. Back when I was much younger at the ANU, it was actually the topic of my PhD thesis, and I was
in my former center.
I beg pardon?
In my former center.
Yes. And I have been personally driven in wanting to see such a treaty be established, and I was obviously very pleased with the Bangkok Treaty when that came about. We did as much as we can to make us good progress in 2011, and to this date I remain terribly disappointed that I failed in my attempt to get the accession by the nuclear weapon states to that particular treaty. I remember, as our colleague just now had mentioned, back in 2011, we were all convened in Cambodia, ready to welcome the accession by all the nuclear weapon states. It was the last-minute reservations or declarations by, of all countries, Great Britain and Russian Federation, that caused some disruptions within ASEAN, and as a result, the whole process was postponed, and we are where we are. I think looking back, if I was to revisit the approach, I would perhaps not sought for perfection from the beginning, and rather would pursue a TAC type of approach, where we can open accession to the Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone on a step-by-step incremental basis, and have those countries that are ready to accede, such as China, United States even, and others, to actually begin the accession process, and hence create a competitive, dynamic process where nuclear weapon states, in the end, that are still holding out, in the end choose to join, as we saw on TAC, because the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation initially was acceded to by China, India, and of course Japan are compelled to follow suit rapidly. So we had a very competitive, positive dynamics created. And I think the Shonfish Treaty, perhaps policymakers may want to take stock of how best to proceed and take things one step at a time rather than to have a perfection from the very beginning. The second point I want to mention is the question of leadership. I believe, we have plenty of leaders, but the leadership is that we are having a shortage of, or deficit of. this is where I'm not sure whether we can actually point to countries or parties or groups that can exercise such leadership, because leadership is earned, it cannot be imposed. And I don't think it's necessarily a function of power per se. ASEAN in the past had occupied that nice position, having the comfort level of many countries of the region, not necessarily because of its own actions, maybe probably out of default. But I feel that we are at the moment in a sense of drift. ASEAN must be a bit more aggressive now, I think, in exercising leadership, and above all, to have a script around which to exercise that leadership. And I'm seeing at the moment a policy vacuum, and this is a time when we need to put on our thinking cap and pursue certain objectives that we can aggressively pursue. One or two initiatives that I thought is worthy of ASEAN efforts is this notion of PAC for the entire region of East Asia, as well as the crisis management capacity through the East Asia Summit. But those are just some examples. But what is most missing at the moment is actually that quality of leadership that we have just now recognized we are in need of. But those are some of the points that I wanted to share at this stage. Ramesh.
Thank you very much. That's actually a very nice, neat summary. We have many leaders, but not much leadership in the world today. Nobu, I'm going to come to you. It seems to me that as the only country to have suffered the use of atomic weapons, Japan has enormous political capital. And one of the great puzzles of the entire nuclear arms control community is how repeatedly Japan punches well below its potential weight in this field, and again doesn't exercise the leadership that is there for Japan's asking.
Thank you. About the leadership question, or this broader question of regional structure, I'm not in favor of the thinking of institution for the sake of institution. Historically, major institutions are born out of a very serious concern about certain questions, out of the need, and they were born more out of as a consequence rather than from pre-conceived idea. The question about Japanese leadership, I think your point is well taken. Japanese political leaders have been saying that they will take leadership in the world nuclear disarmament efforts, non-proliferation. I welcome the statements, but they have not been doing enough to follow through. In fact, they're doing all kinds of trivial things, but not major leadership. That's, I think, a fair statement. But one point, given the subject today, this roles for the non-nuclear weapon states, I have a particular point I want to make, which relates to Japan, South Korea, and Australia. 3 non-nuclear weapon states, but allies of the United States. They can make great contribution by stating we have full confidence in American nuclear deterrence, and we have confidence that Americans have enough nuclear forces now. We don't need to have spent so much more money on modernizing American nuclear forces. The more these 3 countries express concern about the nuclear deterrence of the United States, they encourage people in Washington who want to have more money for modernization. That's very damaging. So that's my advice.
Thank you. Actually, that leads me to the final question that I want to address to Kim Won-soo. Wonsu, you've just stepped down as the High Representative of the Secretary General, and therefore you were, in fact, following Nobu as well, the face of the international community in the search for this cause. And now you are back here as a citizen of this country, which is, as we just heard, an umbrella state. Given your experience in the UN system, how do you now recommend that the umbrella states take up the leadership slack between the vast majority of non-nuclear weapon states and the countries that actually have nuclear weapons in advancing the cause? Because it seems to me it's an obvious role for the umbrella states to advocate for greater sanity rather than continuing modernization and expansion.
Well, absolutely agree with you, and also I 100% endorse the points made by this report. The problem for countries like Korea, Japan, and Australia, the common challenge for these three countries is that we are living in a very paradoxical situation. On the one hand, we are arguing for denuclearization because of the obvious reason facing our brothers in the north. But on the other hand, even boycotting the negotiation on the prohibition trade is not logical. And I see the more these three countries join the negotiation and make the case why we have to delegitimize nuclear weapons, then I think it will be morally stronger vis-a-vis our brothers in the north. But because of the position taken to boycott the negotiation, we have lost very valuable opportunity to influence the deliberation and even the outcome. But still, as Ranesh said this morning, they can reserve the right to dissociate at the end of the deliberation. But by boycotting it, we are losing a very valuable space to play bridges. Because we have two groups. And those in the middle refuse to join the deliberations. And then it will tend to bring the hard lines on both sides going like this. But we have shared interest to do everything possible to bring this deliberation like this. So by boycotting it, we allow hard lines to help each other. That's the classic dilemma. We are happy every front of security. And we have to rectify it, but now I'm back as a private citizen, so I will step on my voice to try to prevail on the meeting.
Thank you very much. Of course, we have already involved members of the audience in the discussion and conversation. We still have a few minutes left. If there is any comment, General Pan Paul Meyer. No, here, sorry, in the front. General Pan Zhenjiang.
Thank you. I was very much intrigued by a very interesting discussion about the leadership in promoting nuclear stability, in promoting a kind of way towards a better world, a world without nuclear weapons. Now, in my perspective, I think that we need really a leadership. A leadership which could provide a vision that could point the way for all the countries to work together for nuclear disarmament, and peace and stability, which should be in the interest of all the countries concerned, not only for the group of countries. I think this is very important. Now, if my perspective works, and then I think that the role of those non-nuclear weapon states that we mentioned, like Japan, like South Korea and Australia, would have a major fatal problem. I even suspect, so far, are they really non-nuclear weapon states? These countries have no capability to pursue independent foreign and security policy. And therefore, I think that the role they can play in mobilizing the strength for nuclear disarmament would be very much limited. And I think the same situation also goes to Asia. I think China strongly supports the leadership role of ASEAN in the regional cooperation and even integration of East Asia. But I think that for that purpose, ASEAN will have to prove, now, number one, it has its own solidarity among its own members. If there is a serious division among its own members, and I think that the role it could play would be very much limited. And the second thing I think is also important that in a time we see a kind of a major power rivalry, ASEAN should not take sides. And I don't think some of the countries, the kind of vision to depend China on economy, to depend the United States on security would be a good idea. And therefore, I think that this is very clear. The leadership would have to be pursuing a policy which works for the interests of all the countries concerned, not only for some of the countries or group of countries.
Thank you, Ambassador Paul Meyer. We are really expanding our horizons. Is Canada really a non-nuclear weapon state?
Well, Ramesh, in reference, I felt marking Mr. Northy's comment that leadership is not only a function of power was very apt, and it's a reminder that it is something that's exercised at times by very modest powers. I think of Austria in particular regarding the humanitarian initiative. We need to encourage that form of leadership. But I also wanted to comment about some of the pessimistic references earlier to a nuclear order where all power was vested with the P5, the sense of non-nuclear weapon states being merely bystanders. I would submit to you that in the last few months we've seen a dramatic, in fact, rejection of that nuclear order. We have 120 plus states embarking on a prohibition treaty negotiation that is a radical rejection of nuclear orthodoxy. And I would hope that this new moral majority, if I might view it in that way, will have a profound impact on the thinking of world opinion, and ideally over time on the substance. So I would enjoy hearing any further comments on that regard, because I thought we had a little bit too much downbeat tone set by the panel earlier, and I do see some important signs of hope in this, in a sense, rebellion of the long subservient non-nuclear weapon states.
Thanks very much. I'll come back to the panel for quick 1 minute, any final thoughts, summaries. Just pick one item if you can, and then we'll close up, and we'll close up on time. Lalit, we'll start from you.
Well, taking the last comment of Ambassador Myers, I wish and hope that there is a change in the global nuclear power structure. But if you go by past experience, and we have gone through so many false hopes, so many false dawns, I would like to believe that this is a fundamental change. But my realistic sense tells me that we are scoring a moral point, but I don't know whether it's going to lead to a reorganization of the power structure, and the nuclear powers are going to hand over or dilute their authority. Having said that, I think the panel discussion gives me a ray of hope. And if I am guilty of having said something undiplomatic about ASEAN, I would say in justification that I have successfully provoked Meli into saying that ASEAN will take up a leadership role and will strengthen its capacity to bring peace to the region. Thank you.
Meli.
How did you describe Gareth last night? Incorrigible optimist? Yeah. I'd like to use the word optimist or idealist. I've always considered myself a student of politics. I've been inspired by some of the works of Gareth, not just on, his work on, particularly on the responsibility to protect. But the fact of the matter is, sometimes when I just put on a realist hat, and everything is really bleak. But if I look around, and if just for a moment remove the problem of nuclear weapons and see how much progress has been done by the rest of the world in coming together and addressing common threats, like, for example, climate change, which has been forever, started in the works from the early 1990s, and we finally got something through the Paris Agreement, and you had finally China on board and India on board, hopefully, then there is that hope, but hope tempered with caution. And which brings really to the core the role of other actors aside from states. I mean, I like the idea raised by Yongso about what the scientific community can do. And if I look at the work that I've been doing in the field of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and on global health, it is the other actors aside from the states that have really made a difference. And perhaps in the world of nuclear weapons, the kind of rebellion that you've mentioned, Ambassador, led by other states, is actually, I think, also supported by the rebellion by other actors that really want change. And that change, I think, is even within ASEAN. I mean, Ambassador Marthi talked about, ASEAN losing its grip, and the demand and is there from its citizens to get its act together and address really the major problems that are facing the region and that really affect the plight of its people. So it is that, I think, the role of other actors aside from the states that I think we should actually be paying more attention to. Thank you,
Marianne.
Thank you. Look, I'd like to say that there hasn't been a complete absence of leadership, and I think one of the most profound examples of leadership is here sitting in the room, and we see what Gareth has done. And I'm reminded that the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons was released over 20 years ago, right? The ICNND was also released, but without a supportive context, without states really taking these initiatives up, and championing them and moving them forward, keeping that momentum going, it's very, very hard to sustain it. But keep on being an optimist, and I will be right there with you, Gareth, so we have to keep doing it. By the way, there's also a realist case for nuclear abolition. There's quite a lot of writing on that now, promoted by none less than Henry Kissinger himself. Paul Meyer, I entirely agree with you. I think we are seeing a dramatic change in the nuclear order, right? It's nothing to do with power, particularly. It's to do with norms and law. And I think that there's a tremendous potential here. Already, it has changed that dynamic. What I would like to see is Canada to sign up. What I would like to see is Australia, Japan, and Korea to sign up. And, you know, there's a vast difference between Austria and Australia, and I just wish that our government would come on board.
Thank you. Young-soo?
Yes, it's a very challenging job whenever you are trying to have any kind of dialogue. I'd like to know whether you have a very successful story to have a real dialogue with your kid. It's impossible, actually. That's the nature of human beings. As well pointed by General Pang, sometimes a small group of countries or small group of organizations would like to educate the entire society. Then you will end up with a failure. We had a lot of experience in nuclear engineering. We have all this confrontation between pro-nuclear and anti-nuclear people. And it's very difficult to have a good solution within a matter of days. What we need to solve the global nuclear problem and all other problems is to have a consistent dialogue with goodwill. And we should not expect a short-term outcome. We should work hard every day to cultivate a culture. Unless you have a cultivate a culture, it's to me, as a layman, I don't believe you can have a complete success. So I'd like to support any kind of dialogue, two-way dialogue, not unilateral dialogue. Especially when somebody from Australia says something about the global nuclear peace, people might think indifferently in Asian society. Yeah, so we have to respect each other's position. Unless you really understand your neighborhood as a friend or enemy, whatever, you cannot make a big success. So to me, we need a first step to have a real dialogue. The two-way communication is very important, not for any kind of civilian life between you and your kid, but also it's very important for the global society.
Thank you very much. Let me say two things in drawing this session to a close. Firstly, a reminder that even under the NPT, global nuclear disarmament is the responsibility of all the states parties under the NPT, not just a responsibility solely of the 5 nuclear weapon states. And I think, as Paul said and as Marianne reaffirmed, from this point of view, the key takeaway from the UN mandated ban treaty conference is that the vast majority of nuclear weapon states, including 2/3 of the NPT member states, have reclaimed agency in driving nuclear policy. And I suspect that is going to be irreversible. So the nuclear countries and the umbrella states had better get used to the new normal. Second comment, I think as you've seen, not just up in the panel, but in the room, we have extraordinary depth of expertise and experience, as a result of which we've had a wonderful conversation, and would you please join me in thanking everyone for that happy result.